What does an 8th century BC Assyrian invasion, a 1st century AD public bathing pool, and a 21st century Palestinian rocket attack all have in common? That is the question with which we begin this morning. Well, we don't really have time for the full story today, but it's a story which began nearly 3,000 years ago during the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah. In the days of the prophet Isaiah, King Hezekiah was on the throne. They were threatened by the mighty power that was Assyria, led by King Sennacherib. Who else? But King Hezekiah had constructed a most ingenious tunnel beneath the ancient city of Jerusalem in order to bring a supply of fresh water into the city in the event of a siege by the Assyrians. Now, several years ago, during a visit to the city of Jerusalem, I happened to be walking through this very tunnel, wading through the water, which at times rose well above my knees, in the midst of what I later discovered was the second of 2 air raids to take place during my visit to Israel. I only heard of this later that evening over dinner and realized that I had possibly been the safest person in the entire city. At such a depth, I hadn't even heard the sirens go off. Now, at the far end of this tunnel through which I had been wading, there is a pool of water. It's slightly long and rather narrow, and it was known for years as the Pool of Siloam. Well, as it happens, this is actually not the more ancient pool of that name, which is located a short distance away. And it was there almost 2,000 years ago, in the first half of the 1st century AD, where something quite remarkable took place. Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth, was in the city of Jerusalem with his students when he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Well, this led to something of a theological discussion among his students, which in turn led to Jesus repeating a claim which he had made a little while earlier. The claim was that he was the light of the world. Well, the next we know is that Jesus spat on the ground, he made a little mud with the spit, and he spread it over the blind man's eyes. And he then told him to go and wash himself in the pool of Siloam, which he did. And then he came back able to see. Absolutely remarkable. But this is only the beginning of the story. Onto the scene come some neighbors and some others who had known this man as the blind beggar. And there's some confusion among them as to whether he was or whether he wasn't the very same man who used to sit and beg. But the man himself kept insisting that it was him. And so they wanted to know just what had happened and how he had been healed from his blindness. And so he told them. He told them what I've just told you, how that the man they called Jesus had made mud and spread it over his eyes and told him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash himself. And so he said, well, that's what I did. And now I can see. Well, you can imagine that there was some skepticism and some confusion. So they wanted to know where this Jesus was. Well, the chap told him that he didn't know. So instead, they took him to some of the religious people. Now, before we say any more, you would have thought that everybody would have been over the moon on hearing about this man who was able to see for the very first time in his life. Everybody would be, sending him cards, congratulating him on his newfound sight and wanting to share in his excitement. But oh no, no. There will always be those determined to find something wrong and who are set on pooping the party. I mean, when the world needs a bit of positivity and optimism, there will always be those intent on seeing only the negative side of things and sharing their fears and their woes. And the religious people seemed particularly good at that sort of thing. The moment they heard what had happened, some of them were outraged. Seriously. Whoever he was, they thought, this man, Jesus, he couldn't possibly be from God because this healing took place on the Sabbath. Dearie me. Now, we probably ought to say something about the significance of the Sabbath and something about the way in which the religious people had taken something positive and turned it into something that was both burdensome and memorable for all of the wrong reasons. The simple idea behind this weekly day of rest for the Jewish people, the simple idea was that it was to serve as a reminder of how God had created the heavens and the earth and then rested from his work. It was to remind the Jewish people of what God had done in delivering their ancestors from slavery in the land of Egypt and how that he had given them rest from their oppression. It was all about reminding the people of who they were as the people of God and of his constant goodness towards them. Well, instead, the religious people had turned it into a matter of legality and legislation. Rather than having anything to do with the relationship which God desired to have with his people, they had turned the Sabbath into a matter of rules and regulations that did nothing to bring the people any closer to their God. They had turned the way of life into a religion with all of its rituals and complicated rules. And it was some of these complicated rules which they claimed that Jesus had broken. Well, it really was rather tragic. These religious people claimed to know all about God and his ways, but in truth, they knew absolutely nothing. They may have been able to quote lengthy passages of scripture, but they didn't have a clue what they meant. When it came to the things of God, they were blind. It's as if they were stumbling about in the dark. They gave everyone the impression that they knew the ways of God. They were experts at what we might call virtue signaling, but they were nothing more than hypocrites, blindly leading the blind. It probably all sounds rather familiar. We should say that not all of the Jewish religious leaders saw things the same way. In fact, there was a deep division of opinion among them on this occasion. Some of them were convinced that Jesus was nothing whatsoever to do with God because he was violating their understanding of his ways. But others couldn't understand how just an ordinary person was able to do such amazing things, such as restore sight to the blind, regardless of what day of the week it was. So they asked the man who had been blind some more questions. They wanted to know what he thought about Jesus. Well, understandably, he was impressed. I mean, after all, for the very first time in his life, he was able to see. And so he told them that he thought that Jesus was a prophet. Well, the thing is, that didn't fit in with their ideas, with their theology, if you like. So they began to doubt whether this man had actually ever been blind in the first place. And so they called his parents to see what they had to say. It's as if they were being summoned to some sort of, religious kangaroo court, if you like. Well, his parents told the religious leaders that this was indeed their son, and that he was indeed, or had indeed been born blind. But they said they didn't have a clue as to how he could now see, or even who it was that had healed him. If they wanted to know that, then they were going to need to ask their son himself. After all, he was old enough to speak for himself. It looks as if they weren't really telling the truth. The thing is, you see, the religious leaders had made it known that if anybody said that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was from God, that they would be thrown out of the synagogue. And this chap's parents didn't want that. You see, to be thrown out of the synagogue was to be socially excluded, ostracized, and to be considered as an outsider. It was a rather serious business in those days. And apparently they cared more for their social standing than they did for their once blind son. Perhaps they never had really liked him. I mean, after all, he must have been something of a drain on their resources, and had even had to resort to begging for a living. No, they didn't know these things, or rather, they chose not to know these things. Where the religious leaders were simply spiritually blind, the parents of the healed man chose not to see. They lived in fear. They lived by fear and not by faith. And rather than stand up for what they knew to be true and for one whom they should have loved, they cowered behind the hypocrisy of the religious leaders and the system that they represented. And so the drama continued. They bring back in the man who had been born blind and tell him that Jesus was a fraud. Well, he was having none of it. And so the conversation ends up getting rather heated, with maybe some sarcasm thrown in, if not some simple incredulity at the real blindness of those in charge. And to cut a rather long story short, they call him names and then they throw him out of the synagogue. I mean, isn't that the way it goes? Some people, even people in high places, if they can't handle the evidence, they'll call you names and then they'll throw you out. Nothing's changed. But I rather like this man. I don't know whether he ever did get to see the inside of the synagogue, but I don't think he could have cared less. He really doesn't seem to have cared for these religious games and the politics and the power that accompanied them. He didn't care about the ridiculous rules and regulations that were all so important to these religious leaders. And he certainly didn't care for their hypocrisy. But he did love truth. Yes, I like him. I mean, he wasn't going to be intimidated by the religious bullies, for that's what they were. Not only could he now see his lifelong surroundings, but he could also see right through the pretense and the deceit of those who should have been shepherds to the people. But they were nothing of the sort. To the religious leaders, God was simply a means of giving them power over others whilst making themselves look holy. What an absolute sham. And yes, nothing's changed, has it? Well, it's no wonder they didn't know who Jesus really was. If they didn't know God, then it isn't surprising that they didn't know Jesus, the Son of God. And when he got to hear about what had been going on, he found the man whom he had healed, and he asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" That was a term that Jesus used to identify himself with the common people. "Do you believe in him?" he asked. Well, this man wanted to. He must have heard of him as he had sat begging all those years, and he knew it was the man called Jesus who had opened his eyes, but it seems as if he hadn't yet knowingly set his newly opened eyes upon him. So Jesus says to him, "You have seen him, and he is speaking to you." I love that. Isn't that wonderful? You have seen him. Words that would never have made sense to him before. And so he says, "Yes, Lord, I believe." And then he worshipped Jesus. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, what else could he have done? All his life he had been blind, but now he could see. He could see light and people and colors and buildings and water and sky. And right before his eyes, he saw the one who had opened them. And so he worshipped him. And Jesus says to him, "You know, this is why I came, to give sight to the blind and to show those who think they see that in truth, they are the ones who are really blind. There's none so blind as those who think they see, yet haven't got a clue about the things of God." As one writer would later say, we're not looking at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. In a world where the political and religious institutions are led by the blind, leading the blind, is it any wonder that so many struggle to find sense in this world of darkness? Of course, we could choose to be like the parents of our new friend and choose not to see by the light of God, but that would be rather silly, wouldn't it? No, 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 no. If we have seen the light that has come into the world, let us live by it, even if to do so would have us cast out of our synagogues, whatever they might be for us, and let us walk in the light of God. As those who once were blind, but who now see most clearly, let us not be afraid to see things the way they really are. As those whose eyes have been opened, let us pray that God will continue to open the eyes of our hearts, that we may know what is the hope to which we've been called, the riches of his glorious inheritance, the immeasurable greatness of his power toward us who believe. May God bless each one of us, that we might be a blessing to the world around us. May he bless us in his light, that we might shed light on the lives of those around us, that many might yet come to see the real Jesus, the one who is the light of the world.